one of the insights of the night of the previous day was that my colleague Anna formulated. She said, you can not build a strong enough bridge to somebody else unless you have built a bridge to yourself before that. So Bruce, it's lovely to see you here. It's so great that you are covering this topic. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for having me back. I'm super excited to talk about this. I also apologize if my dogs start howling, because they typically do when I go live. So anyway, and yeah, how do I follow the last three speakers, or all of them really? But all right, so I am trying to, do you want to bring up my slide?
And I'll be off the air. Thank you so much. All yours.
And thanks for having me again. All right, so yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to start out with a bold statement to say that most leaders actually don't know who they are as people, and they tend to rely on broader communal or organizational narratives and narrative structures in how they define themselves. And actually, this can be quite limiting. It puts them in a passive position and can be quite censoring, because those broader narratives, while they are important narratives, certainly have a different function and purpose, and it's generally not about kind of telling unique, personalized stories. So that's a really bold statement. I guess the result of this is that we find that every leader's story actually sounds the same, even though that they believe that it is kind of a very highly personalized story, and they may use different examples, but at the end of it, it's really kind of the same structure, and they are kind of using these broader narratives, which means that their personal stories actually all sound the same. So I work with people as a leadership coach. I work with leaders to really think about how do they reauthor those stories, how do they create more unique stories, how do they find their voice, and certainly how do they reposition themselves and their own narratives in relationship to those broader stories. So today I'm actually going to talk to you about a piece of work I did with a group of 17 leaders. They were all females, all around mid-senior level, so super experienced, been doing it a while, and the process really had two pieces to it. So firstly, there was a formal training, which was really some basic pieces around storytelling fundamentals, how to craft a story, how to deliver a story. And then the second part of the story piece of work was about the leadership coaching, which was very much listening to stories and guiding them in a deep process of reflection to get to a really deep understanding of who they are and why they are the leader they are today and where they want to be. So really kind of building on everything that everyone said already, just from a slightly different perspective, but really about reauthoring those stories. Certainly it was an iterative process. So we started the process asking all of the leaders to actually come up with their personal value story, which they presented to the entire group before we started. We then kind of moved on to obviously doing the formal training pieces and then kind of moving through some coaching. So as I move forward, really, just to kind of make my own theoretical foundations kind of very clear, and how it informs my work is that I work in a very systemic and narrative way. And so from narratives, there's some fundamental concepts that I hold important, as well as other story workers do, is that there's multiple stories and levels of meaning, and it's about coordinating all of those. That could be out within ourselves, bridging stories within ourselves, but also those much broader organizational cultural narratives. Last year, I spoke about dominant narratives and hidden narratives. This is kind of an extension of that, but getting a lot more personal. We know that stories are co-created and co-constructed because we don't live in vacuums, and leaders certainly don't live in vacuums. And we also know that all stories are valid. Every story has a purpose, and stories are active in nature. There's no such thing as a passive story, but stories can put people in a passive position. So really kind of some fundamental ideas from narrative work. From a systemic perspective, it comes from systemic thinking. It's about kind of focusing on interdependence, interconnectedness, relatedness. We might be looking at things such as socioeconomic factors, gender, age, all of those great things that make us all different and unique, and then the story processes which make us all similar or different too. And so it's really important for us to be thinking systemically in those. Systemic thinking also focuses on things such as relational dynamics. So we look at how do people communicate with each other? How do they make sense of it? How do they relate with each other? So things such as diversity, power dynamics, all of these things are really important in how a leader conceptualizes and articulates who they are, and then that can drive those very personalized stories. And of course, from a systemic perspective, feedback is really, really key. And obviously reflection is such an important part of this kind of work. So kind of really drawing from some of those foundational bases from narrative and systemic. So, you know, once they came to the first session, they all presented their initial drafts of their kind of leadership stories. And really what came out, there was multiple themes, but really this was one of the big pieces. The overarching narrative for everything was one of bias and discrimination, which is really something that we already know exists within female leaderships in a lot of countries and in a lot of organizations even today. And so what we saw was not necessarily surprising, but it was also kind of limiting some of the other stories that were there. So my intention today is to acknowledge the bias, and it's also to help female leaders and male leaders think about what other narratives are out there that they can kind of leverage and talk about and create, and how do they position themselves in relation to these much broader communal narratives. So we're going to acknowledge the bias, and we're going to move on. So, and again, it's not about the sub-themes. That's not the focus of my talk today. I want to really kind of talk about how we help leaders re-author their stories. And that's really about creating the bridge to themselves, a new way of thinking about themselves, a new way of identifying and being authentic as a leader and creating those authentic stories, but also about how do you bridge to these much broader organizational dominant narratives and these social and cultural narratives that we're all very aware of around bias and discrimination in the workplace. So through the stories, you know, there are multiple stories that arrive, but as they were presenting, these were the three that really came out quite a lot. So the org identity story, I would say, is more like a persona story. It's very closely linked to what an organization believes leadership is. So whatever their leadership framework is, you can guarantee that most leaders will start to identify with that and tell stories in that framework. Now, there is some value to that, obviously, but generally when we're thinking about org identity stories, they're very formulaic. They're based on other frameworks around leadership. They're not very personal. When we kind of think about the next type of story that came out was the female leadership bias story. Again, we acknowledge the bias. And here it was really about kind of thinking about how do we get people to identify and relate to those and talk about those in an open space. So once we have acknowledged the bias, certainly it's about inviting those leaders to then start to think about what's the impact of that on their own identity and on their own experience, and how might they use that narrative, or how might they give themselves permission to seek other narratives that also might be really important for them to be able to tell within their organization. And then we all, I guess before I move on, the other piece around the female leadership bias is there is a particular function in this broader communal narrative, right? And it's threefold. Number one, this narrative, this dominant narrative really is about awareness. It's about bringing awareness to, you know, the lack of diversity and, you know, certainly bias and discrimination. You know, the second piece is about kind of allowing those narratives. The function is to bring a change and catalyst, you know, to bring in more equality. And the third piece is certainly kind of around empowerment. So when we look at these dominant narratives, they're really important. We need to acknowledge them because they do represent a truth. And their objectives sometimes might not necessarily be wholly aligned with the stories that particular leaders want to tell at that particular time. So when we kind of look at some general characteristics across these three types of narratives that emerged through this work, we can see that there's a couple of things. The tone really for a lot of these really was about competition, comparison, and defensiveness. These are really kind of important things to note, but it was also kind of not in alignment with what the women were hoping to accomplish by really telling their stories. They were not surprised that these all came out in their stories, but they also wanted to make sure they were able to tell other parts of their story of who they were as a leader. The other piece is those first three really do actually kind of position female leaders in a passive position. So they take the power away from actively creating your own story, because all those three stories really prescribe a way of being, a way of thinking. They have their own function and purpose, and they expect people to fill particular roles. All are very important, all are very valid. And when a leader wants to create a very unique story, we need to work with them to understand who they are and how they relate to those dominant narratives. So clearly, what was missing in all of the initial stories were this very personalized value story. So as we move forward, we after we did the coaching, we did a round of, after we did the training, we did a round of coaching, and it was really agreed that in order to create a powerful personal value story, we needed to look at these four things. So values, so really identifying each individual leader, what was really driving them, what are their values, their core values, their beliefs, their principles, really what defines them as humans and as leaders. Then really kind of looking about how do you articulate your own story in such a compelling way about what the future looks like, that your future as a leader, but also the future of your organization and the teams that you lead. The third part of it is how do you create and articulate a really compelling brand of who you are as a leader? And then the fourth piece is obviously advocacy and kind of encouragement and motivation of inspiring those that you lead, and as a call to action. So that's really kind of the goal of helping these leaders in these sessions to really kind of re-author and reposition themselves and find their voice. So how did we do that? Primarily from reflection. So when we think about these dominant narratives, they play a really important part. But the truth is, the dominant narratives are actually designed to create community and similarity. They're not there to actually create uniqueness. And so when you are trying to tell your unique story about your value as a leader in an organization, you want to make sure that you're focusing what is unique to you, right? Because everyone else's story sounds the same if you're all using the same broader cultural narratives. So reflection really is that process of helping people really kind of get to understand what motivates them, what inspires them, what drives them. And it's a really important process because it goes very, very deep, a lot deeper than kind of just looking at how you might relate to these broader kind of ideas of your expectations of how you should be in an organization. So reflection really is about taking people on a journey. It's bridging from their current perspective, where they want to go, for example, who they want to be, but also understanding the bridges that they've had to cross to get to where they are today. And it's also, again, the bridge of the transformational journey from one side to the next, where you can actually reposition and re-author your entire story to be more personalized. It's about creating that space for reflection. So there's not a lot of space in a lot of corporate organizations to actually reflect. It's all about action. It's about, getting things done. But actually, when you take a step back and you think, it really helps you take a step forward. It's also about kind of helping these leaders through reflection really think about how they think about other people and how they relate to that, and how other people relate to them as a leader. And also, what are the rules that they have interpreted about how the world works, or how organization works, or how progression works, for example, or how do you talk about discrimination and bias. So it's a really kind of powerful way for people to really start to articulate who they are as an individual, and how then to position and re-author their story. So when we move forward, we're talking about, I'm actually asked quite a lot, how do you do reflection? So certainly there's lots of ways. Asking people questions is an actual tool, but reflective prompts and questions, again, it's about helping people think about deeply, more deeply than they do in a general day, like the influences on their life, how they might respond to things, how do they make sense of things, how do they create meaning, how do they relate to people. So you could be thinking about, reflecting on relationships, on dynamics. You could be thinking about how are your narratives, where did those come from, for example. Some of our reflective tools, for example, would be obviously, as I said, reflective questions and prompts, but getting them to really jot down and journal kind of some of those insights, some of their initial gut reactions to some of those questions, or the things that are popping out for them as they are kind of going through the process of coaching, as they are thinking in the back, how does this relate to my personal story? So the goal here is clearly to get to a personalized story, but really it's about developing that deep self-awareness, which a lot of leaders today actually don't, because a lot of leaders' ideas of leadership are based on either, again, these broader narratives, either in our social and community lives or within the organization themselves, or very specifically how they have been led. A lot of leaders don't really know who they are. And so this is a process. Having been a leader in corporate and also in management I had noticed an observation that a lot of leaders might in fact have what seem like very impactful, personal stories, but when you actually deconstruct them, they all sounded the same. They used the same basic information, and they never really gave specific examples of their value. So you might see them say, I'm a great leader, and there'd be nothing to qualify that, right? They just expect you to assume that they're really good at something because they say it. Well, actually, through the coaching, we really help these women leaders, these female leaders, just leaders, we should say, really kind of look for those examples that they could use as really powerful data points to validate kind of what they were saying about their value. So when we kind of look at reflection and narratives over time, right, we know that temporality and time is always important in narratives. My doctoral research, one of the papers actually looks at how narratives change or stay the same over time, and also how those changes or how they stay the same, how that impacts our own identity, specifically, relational continuity, which is our idea of who I am in relationship to someone else, as well as what is our joint identity in relationship to each other. So really important to know that some stories stay the same and some certainly change, and what impact that has on people, yourself, but also those that you're interacting with. And so really when we're looking at kind of time, you're really kind of looking at them to explore things such as what is their career journey, where is progress and success been, where is stagnation been, where are the opportunities for growth, what were their hopes and wishes, what are their hopes and wishes now going forward, and really helping them kind of put all those levels and all those stories, whether they're historic stories, current stories, or future stories about who they are as a leader, they're all important to coordinate and give you a really deep sense of who you are as a leader. So we really got them to reflect very personally about their own process of becoming a leader and those influences. We also look specifically at the idea of leadership, right? I'm a leadership coach, and so I work with leaders around these pieces. And, identity, voice, and style are all already very kind of narrative kind of concepts in nature already. So it works perfectly to, get people when they're thinking about their personal story. So when it comes to identity, again, it's really just about getting people to think about, defining moments on how they've defined themselves as a human and as a leader. It's their values, their beliefs, really kind of digging into who they are, because that's really where the true value is. It's not in comparison to someone else. It's about what do you bring to the table. And so it's really about thinking, how do you show up as a leader? We also talked about voice. And so we talked about, voice in two ways. One is self-expression. And that's really about how do you show up as a leader every single day? What are other people kind of hearing you say? Where do you take a position? Where do you take a stance? How do you actually lead, like what makes you a leader, for example. The other piece really is about empowerment and engagement, right? Because when the initial stories came out, they were about bias and discrimination. So we want to again acknowledge that, be support leaders to be able to articulate what that means and their own experiences. So you can borrow from the dominant narratives and make it your own. So it's really about kind of looking at voice and finding your own voice as a leader. And then the final piece for kind of exploring their leadership journey is what kind of leader are you? And again, really helping them identify where the evidence for that is. So if you are saying you're an amazing leader, where's the evidence? It's also exploring about what other people might say about you. So what kind of feedback have you got? You could also get them to do some, reflective thinking about how others might actually be interpreting their leadership skill or their leadership abilities. And so you start to get people to really think about like who they are and how they're interacting with these broader systems and how the systems are impacting that story to really drive this deep self-awareness. So really kind of we get to the point of you have all of these wonderful insights. Now what do you do with them? So the goal was always to create some sort of value story. And so it's really about coordinating all those different levels. So, in a lot of narrative work, there's many different models, but certainly you can kind of think about different levels such as organizational, cultural, maybe kind of the stories or narratives that come from our own families or other in our own dynamics and relationships, maybe specific incidents of how you actually deal with things, really looking how that translates into the way we think about ourselves, the world, or other people, how that invites us to behave in particular ways. And so you start to coordinate all of those insights from those reflections and you synthesize them into kind of what starts to become a very personalized story. So part of the coaching was also to help them think about then how do you coordinate those levels? How do you synthesize it? How do you put it together in a structure? So the organization at the time did in fact have their own organizational structure. So some of the leaders chose to use what was there, and others chose other structures that they felt was more authentic to their voice and their own story, which was a success. Certainly part of putting a personalized value story together is practicing in front of other people, because anyone who knows, right, you're going to get feedback, both helpful and constructive. You also learn very quickly where your story works and where it doesn't, where you might need to clarify. And really it was about creating that space where people could learn, grow, provide feedback, experiment, and so learn from other peers with very similar stories, but still supporting each other to get to their own unique story without competition or comparison. And so feedback was a really important process, not only for me as the leadership coach, but also from their own peers. So when we move forward, I would say that, obviously we always want to acknowledge the bias, but we also need to acknowledge that maybe bias and discrimination stories, while they play an important part, they might not actually position you in a particular way that you're hoping to lead. And so we want to work with leaders to really reflect on how do they find their own voice within those dominant narratives? How do we help them reauthor those stories in a way that feels entirely authentic to themselves? So just as a side note, some of the women didn't in fact feel that some of the bias discrimination narratives didn't actually resonate with them. They could understand them, they've seen it, but for their own personal experiences, for example, that was not what they've experienced in their careers. And so we always want to just acknowledge that the impact of these broader cultural narratives, and how do we help leaders actually create unique stories in relationship to those. Obviously, working through the growth, it's a very personal process of reflecting and sharing those reflections. And I'm sure not everybody shared all the reflections, but it's a growth process really. And it's about kind of creating that environment of being super understanding, supportive, right? Being very empathic, but also focusing on solutions. So not getting really stuck in the weeds of what maybe kind of bias and discrimination looks like, but really kind of what is my relationship to that as a leader, and how might I use that as part of my story, or if I choose not to use that, I need to feel okay with that too. And so it's really working with people about getting to their personal story, and it's really about a perspective shift. So I'd say number one, we need to be aware that when we're doing story work, we are essentially doing adaptive change work. We are essentially changing systems by working with individuals. Change starts at the story level and it's going to emanate out. And then the second piece is always, always, always acknowledge the bias and discrimination, because it's true. It's a true narrative for very many people. It might not be your narrative, but it is for many people. And sorry, let me just go back. So I would say, you just want to really kind of be mindful of working with people very mindfully, respectfully, because you are asking them to explore parts in themselves that generally people don't want to explore, and they certainly don't want to share it, and they don't want to share it in a group with 18 other people. So really just being mindful and kind of, creating that supportive environment. So know that, a systemic and narrative approach helps us deal with complex issues. When we start to kind of get those insights and use reflection to understand what drives and motivates our leaders, those reflective insights become the foundation building blocks for bridges. And it's those stories, those bridges, that really kind of transform our relationship to ourselves as leaders. We might let go of old ways of thinking, feeling, or behaving and adopt new ways. And it also helps us position ourselves in relation to these more broader dominant narratives. So really kind of thinking about the powerful, transformative nature of stories, and transforming and bridging from where we are to where we want to be. So that's it. Any questions?
Bruce, thank you so much. That was lovely. I like how you
I can't hear you, Artem. I can see you talking.
Okay, let me try. How about now? Okay. The participants can hear both of us.
Is it just me?
I guess so. Okay, guys, if you have questions for Bruce, please write them to the chat.
I can't hear you, unfortunately.
I guess our conference is a bit tired. Webinar is tired of us, guys.
Right, refreshed.
How about now?
I can hear you now.
Yes, we are building the bridge over the technology that is trying to stop us. Okay, so guys, if you have questions for Bruce, now would be the time. And I have one follow-up question, really, about your talk. So I like the part where you were talking about like the past, the present, and the future narratives that we have about ourselves. Here's like I had this case when a client of mine was aiming for a preferred feature story for his group, and when they wrote it as like 20, like 30, whatever, for example. So what if this group achieves this future state, but in this future they will have had a new preferred version of the story that they would be leaving. So this would be like a risk of feeling that you've spent so many time developing a different story. So is there a way to, maybe to work around this risk, or help people in groups or in personal work, whichever you prefer, to mitigate such a risk of working with this defining narrative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it probably comes up quite a lot, right? Is that I think first and foremost is to, I think when you're doing story work with people, you really want to kind of help them understand some of the methodological underpinnings. So the fact that there is no one right story and that stories are co-constructed and change over time is probably an important conversation to have right up front. So people already have that, like, oh, I'm not creating this finite story that's never going to change, right? As well as we kind of know that, what happens in organizations and broader society is we have all of these overarching dominant narratives that, and new narratives that we're bombarded with all the time, with new technologies and new economies and all those types of things that start to impinge. So the idea is to actually encourage not a final story. The idea is to continue to iterate, continue to be connected to kind of the broader systems and understand the changes, right? So, I mean, I would always say help them understand the methodological kind of underpinnings, but also kind of encourage them to be, yes, work towards a specific goal or a story, but always be open to changes, right? Because stories change. The story that you might want to create today might in fact not be relevant a year from now or 5 years from now, right? Or your relationship to that story might have changed, right? Because you're not going to be the same leader or the same team member, right? You are going to grow. So I think we just need to really help people understand that stories grow with us. Yeah.
And this is a very ecological position, I would say, very narrative position, that stories grow with us. And I think the first time I stumbled upon it was in the book of our next speaker. There was a phrase like a law of. I'm not sure if there was a law, but the phrase was, "Every story will change," and it has some inevitability to it. But since a story is fluid and we are defining what we are about, so I hope I'm not messing up what Murray wrote in his great book. We'll get to him later. So, guys, if you have questions, now would be the great time. And in the meantime, Bruce, I'm really curious, since you are like second to last speaker, please add to this question we are discovering this year. So you've came to this conference and you've proved that by this action that people can cross borders to unite for a good cause. So this is a great meaning and it builds bridges. But what's one more meaning you would like to get people inspired about, so there are more bridges around in the end?
Well, so I used to be a clinical psychologist, and one thing that really always stuck out to me from narrative and systemic therapies was this idea that all stories are valid, but not all stories are optimal. And I think this is really important because we very much take positions of, no, my story is right, my experience is right, yours must be wrong because mine is right, right? We relate in ways where we exclude other people's, experiences and stories because we believe ours is right. But actually, every story is valid, right? Because it represents a truth to a person about something at a particular time. Now, that story might not be valid for that person 10 years from now, but it certainly is today. And also the fact that, 2 or 3 people all observing the same experience might come up with different stories. Every single one of those stories is valid because it represents their truth, right? Storytelling is co-constructed, but certainly driven by who we are as human beings. But also the idea that while your story might be valid, it might not be optimal, really kind of invites us to know that some stories might in fact do us harm, or might no longer be working for us, and we might need to reauthor those. It invites us to think about change. So if you hold a particular story about yourself as a leader and that's just no longer functional for you, it's causing you or other people more harm, it's time for you to really do some deep self-reflection and think about, how might I need to change my story? What might I need to do? So all stories are valid, which means we can imagine the possibilities of every single person feeling valid and heard, and feeling validated. And then also the big invitation for all of us to go deep and really search about what we like about ourselves and what we really want to change, because not all our stories, while they might be valid, might not be the most helpful.
I'll just take a moment.
It's
This is good. I feel the scientific part of you talking,
right.
and the narrative part of you connecting to it is like, you
Yeah.
know, we actually have one more question, and Irina, lovely to have you here. Our colleague and also a worker of story. She's asking, how can we encourage participants from NGOs who are basically always shy people, to be more active sharing their stories? They do it online, and sometimes they seem to be a bit shy, and they'll undervalue sharing stories as a part of coaching process.
I mean, I think that's really about how you start the relationship with people. I think firstly, you need to convene with people in a way that they feel heard, understood, respected. I guess you also need to clarify really what you're trying to accomplish. And again, it goes to that creating that environment where reflection is just so normalized, right? So anyone who has a conversation with me, I'm asking questions all the time, I'm reflective. I think you need to model that. If you're asking people to kind of, ask for their stories, you need to be able to share. You also need to, I guess, just encourage.
Bruce, a quick correction. Since I'm connected to this process, I think what Irina is going for is, we have a space both in coaching,
Right,
and a safe 2-hour space with a story circle where they exchange stories inside, and it's safe,
okay.
it's dignifying. But then they have to go out there and share the stories of who they are. So I guess the encouragement was about this part after this safe space, if I got that correctly. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. So I think that's really kind of some pieces around, well, firstly, practice, know your points, right? Have some cue cards, be super confident in what you want to share. I think if people have got to their authentic stories, and if they're talking about passion pieces, people want to share that. But I think before you get there, also kind of the process of just kind of sharing and getting feedback, particularly really helpful feedback, very supportive feedback, can be really super supportive for people. Be like, I can actually do this, right? And I think it's also about, as I was saying earlier, thinking about their own identity, their own voice, and finding ways that people can actually stand up and talk, right?
Got it. Thank you so much. I second the idea you shared about, if people get inspired about their stories, they will be sharing them. And one of the ways to get yourself inspired about it is to show that it, like, hearing it will affect somebody else. So it's like, there is a connection implicit to the story.
Well, let me also add to this, right? So if you feel that you are shy, we can talk about those in coaching. Those are narratives that we tell ourselves. They're limiting beliefs, they're limiting behaviors, and they are stories that we are telling ourselves. So through the process of reflection and getting to who you are as a leader, that would be coming up. I don't feel comfortable. Okay, so what does that mean? Where did that come from? How is that limiting you? What is those narratives that you're telling? How can we reauthor that? How can we prepare you to do something that you're not comfortable with, right? It's all part of the kind of the narrative growth kind of coaching conversation.
Lovely. And I can see the fire is still strong, and Irina says thank you, and Vinod is sharing his thoughts. So Bruce, thank you so much for being a part of it and sharing your truth with us. It was definitely valid.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me again, and it's been really, really great. I really appreciate the chance.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Oh, thank you.